The road to communism is paved with good intentions and small little interventions that the government promises are temporary. Just ask the people of Venezuela, Soviet Russia, China, Cuba, North Korea. Well, you can't ask them. Their government won't let them communicate with the outside world. One of the first steps down that road is always price controls. Price controls themselves are devastating for an economy. No government or politician can understand everything that goes into prices, so any control of them is bound to miscalculate. But the fallout doesn't stop there. In this video, we'll use one specific kind of price control, rent control, to explain the nasty negative feedback loop, the snowball and butterfly effects of price controls. First, let's establish some definitions. First, price. It's just a piece of information that captures the scarcity of different goods and communicates that information. So the price for an 8-ounce block of butter might be $4. That tells you roughly how scarce butter is in your town on a particular day. Thomas Sowell said it well. Prices are important because they are a fast and effective conveyor of information through a vast society. Now, price controls. These are government-imposed restrictions on what can be charged for a good or service in the market. There are two kinds of price controls. A floor establishes a minimum price. So a butter floor would not only be very slippery, it would mandate that no one could sell an 8-ounce block for, say, less than $3. Minimum wage laws are another example. Meanwhile, a ceiling sets a government-imposed limit that prevents prices from going over that limit. That's what rent control is, a cap placed on the rent that landlords can charge their tenants. Let's get into the nitty-gritty effects of price controls, and if you're into those kinds of things, we'll talk a lot about them at LibertyCon in Washington, D.C. Join us there, the link's in the description. We can bundle them into 7 often overlooked effects, and then we'll show how they translate into the 7 steps toward more and more and more government, and if we're not careful, communism. Price controls distort economic activity, aka they create shortages or surpluses. People respond rationally to the controls. They buy more of a good that gets a ceiling and less of a good that gets a floor. And when people suddenly rush out to buy more of something, a shortage develops, which could lead to long lines, like what we saw during the Depression, or empty shelves, as we saw in the first months of COVID. Those shortages or surpluses encourage government to intervene further. The politicians see the long lines and say, "We must do something." See their efforts to combat inflation in the past 4 years and how they've made the problem worse. Next, price controls reduce the incentive for long-term investments. Over time, this exacerbates the original problem of limited supply and high prices, defeating the purpose of the controls. However, in the long term, price controls replace market competition with political competition. Instead of focusing on satisfying consumer needs, businesses redirect their efforts toward influencing political decisions, specifically how the controls are enforced and implemented. This in turn creates further reliance on government. Businesses begin to view government regulators as a source of security, shielding them from market competition. Consumers begin to view government as shielding them from evil, price-gouging businesses. See more on price gouging in Debunking the Price Gouging Myth. Price controls generate uncertainty. In a free market, entrepreneurs struggle to predict consumer demands, but price controls add the challenge of predicting what government will do. This uncertainty complicates planning and raises investment costs. It causes entrepreneurs to further divert their attention away from consumer needs to focus on navigating regulations. Finally, price controls disguise the true causes of economic issues by presenting government intervention as a solution to perceived market failures. These market failures encourage more government action, and the cycle goes on and on. Now let's watch how this plays out in real life, using rent control as an example. Step 1, rent control is introduced. Friedman and Stigler emphasized that rent control policies are often implemented with good intentions, like protecting tenants from rising rents. But as we'll see, that's not what happens. Step 2, housing shortages develop. This is inevitable because suddenly there's a bunch more people who can afford rent in, say, Manhattan. Woohoo! Except wait, there's not suddenly a bunch more apartments available. Those take time to build. There's an additional problem. As Friedman and Stigler also found, the incentive for landlords to maintain existing properties or invest in new housing decreases because their ability to make profits on those properties has decreased. Step 3, government housing programs. With all these shortages popping up, more and more people are left without homes. In comes the government, again, this time saying, "We will build houses for you." If only it were that simple. The problem is government is not good at building houses. Just look at the projects in many major American cities. Step 4, increased government spending. So the government has now taken on the role of house builder and provider for millions of people after causing them to be housing insecure in the first place. How's it going to do that? Those houses aren't going to pay for themselves, so the government must spend more money. And how's it going to get that money? Step 5, higher taxes or deficit spending. To fund new or expanded programs such as housing, infrastructure, or social welfare, governments often raise taxes on individuals, businesses, or specific goods and services. One historical example is the implementation of the New Deal in the 1930s, where the Public Works Administration and Federal Housing Administration were created. Now, sometimes governments increase spending but don't or can't raise taxes. What they do in this situation is deficit spending. In other words, the government spends more than it collects in revenue, then issues government bonds to make up the deficit. This is what happened with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act under Barack Obama after widespread foreclosures and a collapse in housing prices in 2008. The ARRA included $2 billion to rehabilitate abandoned homes and $1.5 billion for homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing, plus another $4 billion to improve public housing facilities. All that sounds good, right? Not so fast. The problem is higher taxes and deficit spending lead to step 6, reduced private investment. It's logical why higher taxes would lead to these things. It's known as the crowding out effect. When the government is heavily involved in housing, private businesses see less opportunity to invest or compete, because who can compete with the government, which has a monopoly on taxation and the use of force? Moreover, say you're a business owner. If you expect taxes to rise, you might hold off on an investment, hoping that after the next election, taxes will be reduced. Simply higher taxes make potential investments less attractive. And if there's a housing shortage, that's the last thing you want. As for deficit spending, as the government borrows more money, it tends to push up the cost of borrowing, aka interest rates, which makes it more expensive for businesses to finance investments. It can also lead to inflation if the government simply prints money to finance its debt. And as inflation rises, private investors often cut back on long-term investments because the value of their returns, indeed the value of a dollar itself, is so uncertain. Step 7, higher prices, shortages, and more government intervention. The original rent control created shortages, bad government housing, increased spending, then higher taxes and deficit spending, followed by reduced private investment, which drives down the availability of housing even further, all of which make prices go up. Now there's increased pressure on the government to do something again. That something tends to be more and deeper rent controls, setting the whole cycle in motion again. But it could also include destructive policies like eminent domain, taking someone's property to create additional housing, or zoning laws, which might force a one-family home to become a two-family home. Those policies have their own nasty, vicious cycles. We covered zoning in NIMBYism versus gentrification, the truth about the housing crisis. Watch that video to learn more. Or if you'd like to learn more about economic policy in general, get a free ebook by visiting the link in the description.